Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 19th of October of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And the most important updates these days are coming from Kherson direction. The Ukrainians launched another wave of attack on the Russian bank of Dnieper River. They managed to cross the river at some places, and currently there are very fierce clashes at some towns. But before we start discussing the situation on the ground, I would like to mention one important event that took place in the northern part of the Black Sea. The United States of America sent another reconnaissance team with including Global Hawk RQ-4B, who was flying exactly in this area and collecting as much as possible information about the Russian army in Crimea and the most important in Kherson. He was tracking the Russian movements, and not probably but 100%, this equipment was sending information to Ukrainian intelligence, who were operating, collecting the information and making a very important decision regarding the operation in Kherson and Dnieper area. But at some point of time, the Russians made something. I don't know what exactly the Russians made, but according to information we have, the American drone RQ-4B Global Hawk lost himself, and as a result of something, he lost connection with the base, and he turned into the automatic mode and started flying in direction of the closest nearest NATO base. As I understand, the Russians used a secret weapon. The Russians could use this weapon before, but the Russians didn't want to use this weapon before the Ukrainians launched their major offensive operation, large-scale offensive operation in Dnipro. And as I understand, as soon as the Russians realized that the Ukrainians launched their final battle of 2023, they took a decision to shut down the Global Hawk and basically to make Ukrainians blind and deaf. I don't know what exactly is going to happen next. Probably the United States of America and the NATO countries need some time to investigate and find a solution how to prevent these cases in the future. But anyway, this is a very big damage for the Ukrainians before the beginning of the Ukrainian another greatest full-scale offensive operation in Kherson direction. The Minister of Defense of Russia reported that as a result of clashes in this area, the Ukrainians lost another 40 soldiers, 4 armored vehicles and 1 artillery system. If you remember, yesterday we discussed that as a result of another reconnaissance operation, sabotage operation, the Ukrainians managed to implement and create the foothold in front of Pridniprovska. Yesterday they were attacking the cities like Poima and Pishanovka, but those attacks were repelled and the Ukrainians were forced to step back to the railway bridge, where they were bombed heavily by the Russian artillery forces, multi-launch rocket systems, tall flamethrower systems, Iskander strikes and guided bombs, and probably there are nothing left in this area. And today the Ukrainians made another attempt to attack, and the sources are saying that the Ukrainians took a decision to cross Dnieper River, not in the same area in the vicinity of Antonovka, Sadova and Pridniprovska. The Ukrainians took a decision to cross the river in front of the cities like Lvova and Tyaginka, the cities that were bombed by the Russians very heavily during October and September. If we increase the number of updates since the beginning of October, we're going to see the number of guided bomb strikes exactly in this area against the 35th, 36th, 37th and 38th Marine Brigades that Ukrainians have already redeployed along the Dnieper with the purpose to cross the river, and the Russians were bombing them heavily. But at day D, the Ukrainians launched their offensive operation. They managed to cross the river, and the first update we got somewhere at 3 p.m., 3:30 p.m. of the local time, and the Russian sources, the most important, reported that since morning of 19th of October, the Ukrainians managed to cross the river and started offensive operation with reconnaissance teams against the Russian positions in the city by the name of Krynki. So that update we got at 3 p.m. The Ukrainians managed to cross and started very short and local operations to attack the city with small reconnaissance teams and so on. But later at 7 p.m. of the local time, the Russians are saying that that wasn't like a reconnaissance in combat. That wasn't like a reconnaissance in force. That was a real attack. The clashes are taking place not just in the fields and along the bank of the Dnieper rivers. The clashes are taking place in the village. The Ukrainians managed to capture a few buildings. They were encircled by the Russians, but the Ukrainians took a decision to defend and to wait the arrival of the reinforcements. Furthermore, the Ukrainians have their positions on the south, on the east, in many directions of the city. So currently we can't color this territory in red. We will keep the red color for at least day, because the Russians have chances to recover their lost positions, to counterattack, and this is exactly what the Russians are trying to do right now. And we'll see what is going to be in this area the next morning, so on the morning of the 20th of October, and then we will understand whether we need to change the color of this territory or we will keep everything at this, and the Ukrainians will be defeated and will be forced to step back, and the situation that took place in the vicinity of Pyshanska and Poima may be the same, so maybe the same story. So for now, let's wait. But one more time, the Ukrainians managed to enter the city, reconnaissance teams, and now there are very heavy clashes exactly in this area. The Russians during the day also were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions in Kazatska. Obviously, they were attacking the concentration of Ukrainian forces, trying to prevent another landing operation, let's say in the vicinity of Kakhovka or Novokakhovka. Furthermore, the Russians were bombing the Ukrainian forces in the vicinity, in the cities by the name of Tokarevka and Ponitiatovka. The same story, the Russians were using guided bombs, trying to destroy the concentration of Ukrainian forces, and obviously we understand that when talking about this area, the Russians were trying to prevent any landing operation or forcing the Dnieper River in the vicinity of Kazachye Lagery. So as I understand, the next night is going to be the most important one. The Ukrainians will make more attempts, and as I just discussed and titled the cities, the Ukrainians will attack. Also will try to make an attempt to attack in direction of Kazachye Lagery, and of course from Kazatske in direction of Kakhovka, Novokakhovka. During the day, the Ukrainians were trying to suppress the Russian artillery systems, and for example, the Ukrainians published the video how they managed to discover another Russian artillery position, Grad system, and as a result of HIMARS strike, the Russian Grad system was destroyed. The Grad system that the Russians were using to attack the Ukrainian bank of the river, trying not to allow them to concentrate forces and to cross the river. So the Ukrainians did, let's say, homework before the beginning of that operation. But one more time, there are very heavy clashes here, we understand, but the most important pictures and the scenes we are going to see from the Kinburn Spit, where the Russians during the morning attempt to cross this Dnieper estuary attack the Ukrainian ship and probably damage and destroy it. So we expect more activity, intensifying of action from this direction as well. During the previous night, trying to prevent the Ukrainians' activities, the Russians launched significant number of attacks against the Ukrainian positions, rare positions in Nikolaev. They were attacking the hospitals, they were attacking the concentration of forces, they were attacking the bases, ammo depots, and storage and equipment, and so on, parking with armored vehicles with the same purposes, trying to prevent any attacks in direction of Russian part of Kherson region. Now we are moving to Zaporizhzhia, to Bradley Square. Today we got also a lot of updates. The Russians continued their counter-offensive operation from the south, and as a result of another attack, the Russians managed to establish control over another tree line that goes from Cheritovatsa in direction of the fields between Rabotina and Verbova. The Russians published the geolocated video. We see that the Russian armored vehicles, one tank and the two armored vehicles with the personnel inside, up to 20-30 soldiers, launched an unexpected attack just along one true line, and as a result of that very small attack with a very small group, the Russians managed to defeat the Ukrainians and to force them to step back. Obviously, the Russians need another night to dig in deeper on these positions and to repel upcoming Ukrainian counteroffensives. And if the Russians are able to do this, they will continue their further offensive operation to the north, trying to split the territory between Rabotina and Verbova at least in two parts. The most important thing from this region is that this is not the only attack from this area. During the previous weeks, the Russians, for example, on the 12th of October, the Russians made the same attack, but the Russians, as a result of previous attack, managed to capture the tree lines, let's say, on the right, on the east, and today the western tree lines. So currently I have updated also the map, trying to show the current position of the Russians in this area. To slow down the Russians, at least as for somehow, the Ukrainians were bombing and attacking the Russian positions with FPV drones. The Ukrainians managed to discover the accumulation of Russian mines, and as a result of FPV drone strike, there was a very heavy explosion, and probably the minefields, like prepared mines, were destroyed. So the Russians are pushing to the north. The Russians also were bombing the upcoming reinforcements using anti-tank weapon. The Ukrainians tried to slow down the Russians, also with a small group, like face-to-face battle, but there was a reconnaissance team, and with anti-tank weapon, another Ukrainian armored vehicle was destroyed. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes on this direction, Zaporizhzhia area, the Ukrainians lost 40 soldiers, 9 armored vehicles, including 2 tanks, and 3 artillery systems. So the clashes in this area is going to take place. Obviously, the Russians will try to return control over the south. over this small salient, and the next target of the Russians is to return control over this territory. So this is exactly the things that the Russians are going to implement within the next days or even by the end of this week. So we'll see whether the Russians are able to do this or not. Now we are moving to the South Donetsk direction. We got also a lot of very interesting updates from this territory. The Russians reported that as a result of artillery bombings, usage of the guided bombs, of attacks of flamethrower systems, as attacks of storm aviation and so on, the Ukrainians lost 190 soldiers and 5 armored vehicles. So as you can see, the level of loss of the Ukrainians is very heavy on this direction. There are almost no activity in the vicinity of Velika Novoselovka, just regular aviation bombings and artillery strikes. So the Russians tried not to allow the Ukrainians to concentrate forces, because maybe the Ukrainians do have some forces in this area, but the most important clashes and updates are coming from the area between Ugledar and Novomikhailivka. The Russians started attacking Ugledar once again, with very heavy pressure. Obviously, if the Russians want to complete and achieve success in Novomikhailivka, they need to increase the pressure in Ugledar direction. And if the Russians are able to do this, they may force the Ukrainians to freeze and pin down some reserves in this area, which will ease and allow the Russians to be more flexible in Novomikhailivka direction, because Novomikhailivka is not a very big village, but the Russians are fighting for this area. Probably have been fighting for this area probably since the beginning of the previous year, since the beginning of this special military operation. So this is a very important area to attack. Furthermore, the Russians controlled Novogledar also using FPV drones, and as a result of another bombing, the Ukrainians lost few armored vehicles in one city as a result of Russian FPV drone strikes. But the most important updates are coming from, of course, Novomikhailivka. The Russians continued the pressure from the north and from the south. When talking about the southern direction, the Russians managed to reach the, the edge 5 position line, and from this red line the Russians, it's something like a hidden position, of course, and from these positions the Russians are attacking Novomikhailivka from the south. So basically already using tanks. They don't need long range artillery systems. They can do this with tanks, pair tanks, pair Corsair, and using tanks they're attacking the Ukrainians from the south. From the northern direction we also have some progress, at least from 2 directions. During the previous 24 hours the Russians managed to discover another Ukrainian FPV drone position using their own drone, and after a very short reconnaissance operation the Russians sent the coordinates and necessary information, and after that, within few minutes, the Russians started bombing and shelling the Ukrainian positions, and as a result of that strike, the entire FPV drone position was destroyed, probably with equipment and maybe with the manpower. Furthermore, the Russians launched a series of offensive operations on the north of Novomikhailivka, between Novomikhailivka itself and the strongest Ukrainian fortifications by the name of Zverinets. The Ukrainians tracked the situation and they sent some FPV drones, and as a result of counteroffensives with FPV drones, the Ukrainians probably managed to slow down or even to stop the Russians. But anyway, we're using this video to show the progress of the Russian forces, that they managed to move further to capture new 3 lines and that they're pushing the Ukrainians, and that the most important, according to the title of Avdiivka news operation, the Russians continue this reducing of this news and something like this. So we are following this situation and expect another wave of attack from the Russians, at least from the north. Now we are coming to the second interesting territory, foothold in this area, about Avdiivka news operation. The Russians started this morning a very heavy artillery preparation of the city, and the source on the ground compares that attack with the attack that took place, artillery attack that took place on the 10th of October at the beginning of the Russian offensive operation. They're saying that the level of attack was the same, so that means that the Russians were planning to do something. And today we got more details and videos from the Ukrainian sources how the Russians were trying to attack from Krasnogorovka in the direction of the railways. So according to this geolocation, we can make a very 100% conclusion that the Russians during the clashes starting from the 10th of October haven't managed to reach the railways. That was a speculation and speculation from the Russian sources. The Russians still on the western edge of Krasnogorovka, and currently they have a purpose, and they have the first goal is to establish control over this square. This is the main Russian objective and plan for this week and for this phase of special operation. The Ukrainian sources published the video how the Russians were attacking. On this video we see a significant convoy of Russian armored vehicles, few armored personal carriers. Some forces landed in this area, started stretching their positions, taking the shelters and fortifications. Few tanks managed to bypass the territory. Some tanks, armored vehicles in this area was destroyed. On this video you can see the Russian tanks moving further to the west. Some machine in this area was destroyed as a result of artillery fire. The rest of machines that were located behind were blocked, and they realized that they are no longer able to continue offensive operation. They took a decision to turn around and to start retreating. As you can see, the armored vehicles in the back start withdrawal. The head machine didn't know that the previous machine was blocked, they continued their offensive operation completely alone. Just one armored vehicle and one tank. So that was a trap, that was an ambush that made by the Ukrainians, and we see that the Russians managed to concentrate a lot of forces, but something went wrong. Most of the group was cut off from the head group that continued their offensive operation. We see the Russian tanks alone attacking further in direction of Ukrainian positions, but at some point the Russian tank got on the minefield and was destroyed. So that was like the this day, now the 19th of October, offensive operation in direction of Stepovo and Berdichi. Yet the Russians haven't managed to reach the railway tracks, and so that's why the clashes still continues in this like white zone. Further, the Ukrainians published more videos of the destroyed Russian armored vehicles among the fields. Few tanks, probably even up to 2, 3, or 4 armored vehicles were left by the Russians among the fields, and currently it's unknown whether the Russians were able to land and to capture the 3 lines in front of them. Anyway, the clashes and storming operation of Avdiivka continues. When talking about the southern direction, we haven't received nothing about any progress of the Russians in the vicinity of the stronghold by the name of Tsarskaya Okhota. So, but we expect some activity, and maybe the next day or the next 12 hours we're going to receive more updates, because the Russians were attacking not just from the north but also from the south as well. During the day, the Russians were trying to suppress the Ukrainian FPV drone positions, the Ukrainian artillery positions, trying to suppress them and not to allow them to attack the Russian offensive forces. But now, as we understand, that wasn't enough for the Russian forces on the north. But one more time, when talking about the northern Russian offensive operation, the Russians failed not because of like Ukrainian counterattack or Ukrainian mighty. Everything is simple: minefields and brushes, nothing more. That was those were the reason why the Russians were so unsuccessful during the 19th of October attack. And of course, artillery strike against in the brushes, when they managed to split the convoy in 2 parts, and another destroyed artillery system somewhere in the vicinity of Karlovka. Another important update is coming in Avdiivka, and the Ukrainians, to be more precise, Zelensky required from Zaluzhny, the head Ukrainian army, not to give up Avdiivka for no matter what, no matter the losses. And even if the Ukrainians need to spend the entire Ukraine, the entire population, but not to give up Avdiivka, then Zaluzhny need to spend the entire Ukrainian population, but not to give up Avdiivka. This is critical area, and this is like the final battle of 2023. And who wins Avdiivka battle probably will win the campaign of 2024. Furthermore, the Ukrainians are so afraid of losing Avdiivka, so that's why they have already redeployed Leopards in this direction. Today we got videos from this area, and the author of this video claims that on this video we can see the real Leopard in Avdiivka direction. This video is not geolocated, so I don't know where exactly the Russians managed to discover this type of weapon, but we see that stakes are rising. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes on Donetsk direction, the Ukrainians lost 260 soldiers, 7 armored vehicles, including 1 tank, and 6 artillery systems. As you can see, the Russians tried to continue successful counter-artillery duels, because they understand that the first the first paragraph to be successful is to suppress the enemy's artilleries. And this is exactly what they're trying to do. And probably the Russians managed to find a solution to get some skills, experience how to do this successfully. For example, in the vicinity of Bakhmut and Artyomovsk, the Russians managed to destroy a lot of Ukrainian forces, positions, armored vehicles, supply machines, and so on. But there are no clashes and changes on the ground. Very interesting updates are coming from Siversk direction. The Russians also launched some offensive preparation, artillery preparation, offensive operation in direction of Siversk. The Russians were bombing the Ukrainian positions along the railways in this area and along against the Ukrainian positions in Siversk itself. For example, this is the bombardments of the Ukrainian forces along the railways. This is the next target for the Russians to storm. Probably the Russians have launched already artillery preparation, and within the next maybe 24 hours we need to expect another attempt of Russian attack along the railways to the north in direction of these positions. So we'll see, and I expect that this operation is going to take place, obviously. Furthermore, the Russians were bombing, as we discussed, Siversk and the area in the vicinity of Siversk. On this video, we see how the Russians managed to discover the Ukrainian M777 howitzer, and as a result of artillery strike, of counter-artillery duel, that howitzer was destroyed. But no changes on the ground, so just artillery preparations. When talking about Leman frontline, the Russians reported that as a result of fierce clashes, artillery duels, and so on, the Ukrainians lost 235 soldiers and 6 armored vehicles. The level of losses on Leman frontline is very heavy. I don't remember such numbers since the beginning of creation of this frontline. For example, on the 15th of October, a few days ago, the Ukrainians lost 145 and 140, 14th and 15th of October. Then we have 65, then we have 115, 60, and now 235. So obviously something very big and huge currently is taking place in this direction. And the only thing that comes to my mind is that the Russians made another attempt to attack and storm the cities like Makeyevka and Nevskaya. Today we have the videos how the Russians were bombing these cities, bombing them very heavy. So this is something like, that was something like artillery preparation, and trying to discover and destroy the Ukrainian ammo depots and supply machines. And the Russians, there was updates that the Russians were attacking like this area, this line from Plaschanovka using the armored vehicles, but yet we haven't received any confirmations that the Russians managed to enter this territory. So the battle for this territory is very heavy, and the losses of Ukrainian forces confirms this information. When talking about Kupiansk Leman front line, there are no changes on the ground. Maybe there are very heavy clashes. Some sources are saying that the Russians managed to maintain their positions and to move further from Orlyanka, somewhere in this area. Probably we're gonna receive some updates about this situation very soon, but like no specified information, no geolocations to understand the real positions of the Russians. According to the Minister of Defense, the Ukrainians lost 70 soldiers, 6 armored vehicles. The Ukrainians published the video how they managed to discover the Russian multi-launch rocket system positions that the Russians were using to support their offensive forces, their offensives in Sinkovka, Kislovka, Kotlarovka. The Ukrainians were tracking and the Russian system. They discovered the Russian ammo depot. Then at some moment another Grad system arrived at the same area, and that was a perfect moment and perfect target for the Ukrainians, and as a result of HIMARS strike the entire system was destroyed. 2 artillery systems were destroyed. And this is about the end of the story of Kupiansk. And one more time, something very important, a lot of clashes, a lot of things are taking place, Kherson direction, Kupiansk, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, everything is very important. But something important, something very important took place today with Global Hawk 4Q, RQ4B. For some reason, that system lost itself and lost connection with the main base and was forced to step back and withdraw from the Black Sea. Obviously, the Russians used some secret weapon, and as I understand, they have found a solution, and maybe the next months we are no longer going to see the global hawks about the territory of the Black Sea. And if the Russians are able to do this and to start ruining this type of aircrafts, of course this is going to be significant victory in the Black Sea for the Russians. This is going to be complete victory of the Russians over the battle for the Black Sea. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.